Hello, everyone. This is Brandon, and this is my week 3 presentation discussing compensation, more specifically, the paradox of needs between an organization's view of compensation versus an individual's view. So, compensation is a means to an end for the individual. That will be us. It's a way for us to fulfill our lifestyle. We use compensation to purchase homes, food, shelter, and means of entertainment and leisure. Organizations, at least in the private sector, they use compensation to entice talent. They use it to derive value from the employees to fulfill their objectives and goals. Whereas in the public sector, compensation is merely just another cost for them to minimize. It's a necessary cost for them to fulfill the objectives entrusted to them by the taxpayers, but also it is their duty to minimize the use of taxpayers' dollars, and compensation is just another cost to minimize. So our text mentions the objective gap. So organizations want the most work from their employees for the least amount of money, whereas employees want the most money for the least amount of work. If organizations had it their way, they would probably work their employees 100 hours a week for $10 an hour. And if employees had it their way, they would rather work 10 hours a week for $100 an hour. So compensation is difficult because it's all about where does the organization and the individual meet in the middle? How do they negotiate? How do they reach an agreement? There's also a perception gap. So our text also mentions that the public believes civil servants are overpaid and underworked, whereas civil servants believe they're underpaid and overworked. So we do have another set of conflicting views. Now, slight side note into the economics of compensation, at least in the private sector, it applies, whereas there is a lot of diminishing returns. So as people make a salary up to about $80,000 a year, that's when their returns of happiness are maximized. And then once they start making a salary beyond $80,000 a year, they start to derive less happiness up until to the point where they're making $200,000 a year. And then any increase in salary, they do not have any additional happiness. So now we see, okay, if you want to make an individual happy, just pay everyone $200,000, everyone's going to be happy. In the private sector, that may be a lot easier if it's a successful business, Microsoft, Apple, they could afford to do things like that. And that's why you see such high salaries up in Silicon Valley. Whereas the public sector, it is their duty to be good stewards of taxpayer dollars. They can't afford to, they can't pay everyone $200,000. So they're probably paying people in between, $20,000 to $60,000. And that leaves a gap, up until $80,000 where people seek additional value, seek additional happiness. And then, of course, beyond, they have other returns of happiness they could derive up to $200,000. So that's just an interesting tidbit. Now, again, I mentioned that graph applies to the private sector because in the public sector, there's an additional factor that comes to play. And that factor is that public servants derive fulfillment from civil service to supplement the non-competitive salary. And so the United States is mentioned in our text that civil servants make much less non-competitive salaries compared to their private sector counterparts. Now, okay, why would they come to work for the public sector? They must derive some other sort of happiness and flourishment from that. And that's, they derive fulfillment from the civil service itself. There's a certain esteem to the position that appeals to them that makes up for the lack of salary. So we have that factor in play. But at the end of the day, we do have rising costs, and life does cost money. You have kids who are going to college, and food and shelter and gasoline prices are going up. So we're it is a factor. You can only supplement lack of compensation to a degree. Then it gets to a point where people do actually seek additional compensation. Whereas organizations, they just view compensation as another cost to manage. They just want to minimize it. So again, that just brings us to the paradox of needs. And it's a difficult equation to balance. And that's where we have, at least in the public sector, a lot of unions come in and step up and bat for the individuals to equalize the playing field and sort of help them negotiate and meet somewhere closer to the middle. So that is my presentation on compensation this week, and thank you for listening. I look forward to reviewing your guys' presentations.